Bring in our next guest. He's Patrick Stevens. You may know him from brackets of all sports that are available, but today we talked to Patrick as he covers the Hoyas for the Washington Post. Patrick, thanks so much for hopping on for a few today.
Thanks so much for having me, Brown.
Absolutely. And all right, you've seen this game from both perspectives, from Syracuse, from Georgetown. You're well aware of the history of this. What does this game mean, to Georgetown, to the D.C. area, and to the general landscape of hoops down there right now?
Well, it's kind of hard to say at this point, just because it's been so long since Georgetown's been good that you kind of look at it and you would argue like anything that can generate some sort of excitement and some sort of attention for Georgetown's a good thing. But the Hoyas have really kind of fallen under the radar a bit just because of how the last 6, 7, 8 years have gone. And so, I certainly think that more so than any team that Georgetown typically faces, that Syracuse is a team that moves the needle for their fans and for fans around here. But at the same time, I mean, this is a team that's struggling to kind of get some traction again. And they're 7-2, and they've largely done what they're supposed to do this year, and it's Ed Cooley's job for them to get some traction. So this is, I think, a highlight of the non-conference schedule. But at the same time, Georgetown is certainly in a spot where they're still trying to reestablish things as a program that people need to pay attention to.
Yeah, it's so interesting, the Ed Cooley side of things, right? Because obviously it had fallen, unfortunately, the last couple of years there, Patrick Ewing. I mean, it was at the depth of the bottom of the pits. I mean, you couldn't get much lower than what things were doing there the last maybe year or two of Ewing. We all kind of know Cooley's success story at Providence. We also know, transfer portal, you can turn things around quicker than you used to be able to in college basketball. How big is the job here for Cooley, especially considering how competitive the Big East is?
Well, the interesting thing is that after he came in, he gets hired fairly late, like mid to late March. Sorry, I'm in football mode a little bit here, thinking about hires in November. But mid to late March, and at a place like Georgetown, it's not necessarily as easy to get everybody into school and get all the I's dotted and T's crossed and whatnot. So we relied on some transfers and last year, and it didn't go very well. And so their strategy this year has been, they were selective in who they added through the portal. They added a kid named Micah Peavy, who's their best defensive player from TCU as a grad transfer. They brought in Malik Mack from Harvard. They brought in a couple other guys. I think Jordan Burks from Kentucky, who was kind of a deeper reserve last season, was the most prominent of that bunch. But then they relied on a lot of freshmen. And I think the idea for Georgetown is that they're actually going to do it a little old school, or at least try to, and develop some of these younger guys, like a Thomas Sorber, who's been starting at center all season. You've got guys like Caleb Williams, who comes off the bench as kind of a wing, and Kayvon Mulready, a backup point guard as well, which makes it kind of an interesting way to evaluate them for this season. I think you can argue that you won't be able to determine until about the 1st of May whether it was a successful season for Georgetown, just based on how much retention they're able to do with some of these young guys once the spring and the portal season comes along.
As Patrick Stevens, as well as covers the Hoyas for the Washington Post, Patrick, I have not been down to, where they practice in McDonough Arena and all that for, it's got to be 12-ish years. Whenever Syracuse left the Big East, it would be the last time that I've seen it down there. Obviously, the facilities there, they probably weren't great at the time. Obviously, the actual arena is, a different situation when you're playing in an NBA arena. Has there been, institutional backing of all that stuff? Obviously, when you go out and make the Cooley hire, it feels like it. Has the same been the case in facilities and NIL and all the stuff you need to have the backing for a program these days?
Well, since Syracuse was in the Big East, Georgetown went ahead and built a building called the John Thompson Center that's adjacent. It's adjacent to McDonough Arena, and so they've got, I think it opened in 2016, 2017 in there, and they've got their own practice court and all this other stuff. And so, they certainly were able to push the chips in facility-wise on that back in, maybe 7, 8, 9 years or so ago.
Okay.
They're obviously still playing at Cap One. Now, a problem you have there is when you've struggled for as long as you have, people are kind of reluctant to go and pay pro arena prices for stuff. And so they played in front of some really, really modest crowds at times this season. I think 3 games of less than 3,000 announced in a 20,000-seat arena. That does not look good, obviously. and it's been, except for Notre Dame, a smattering of teams that you schedule, in their bye games. You're scheduling wins as much as anything else. So I think part of Cooley's mandate is to figure out a way to generate more, NIL revenue and what have you. And I think that's, as much as anything, probably the area that was as much a priority last season, even more so than the actual games that were going on, especially when you consider that they only brought 2 guys back from the rotation from a season ago. So I know Georgetown is trying to get itself back to where it needs to be in that sense.
Yeah, it's an extremely different roster looking at it this year than it was last year, which realistically, is the case for so many teams. Sadly, now literally every year trying to figure out who all these guys are. Malik Mack, to us up here, was a name that popped because you go back to March and April when Syracuse was in the market for a point guard as well. There was some admirable one way, maybe a little mutual interest before he ended up at Georgetown. Clearly a Harvard guy you'd think would be able to pass Georgetown's admission standards and get in. What kind of player is Malik after he was so good in the Ivy League last year?
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. He's one of those guys that I haven't quite figured out yet, even after 9 games. So far, I wouldn't say that he's been overwhelmingly great, but you also have to look at, he shares the team lead in assists. He's shooting almost 40% from 3. He certainly had his moments where he's played well. I don't think that he is the most valuable player on the team. I think that's, frankly, Micah Peavy, just because of the value he brings defensively. He's not the best scorer on the team, and I think that's Jaden Epps, who is one of the 2 main returnees. And I don't think he's really the best player. Not the most valuable, not the best scorer, not the best player. I think that's Thomas Sorber. But he's still a really important piece, and it remains to be seen just how well he's going to be able to hold up. The interesting thing when you think about Cooley's teams at Providence, they had all those big guards, remember? Yeah. And, like right now they're trotting out a couple little guys in Epps and Mack. And so that's kind of something that's been interesting to watch, how a Cooley team operates, with smaller guards while trying to maintain sort of that ethos of toughness and ruggedness and all that stuff.
Yeah, I think about Chris Dunn and the guys like that at Providence. They had some dudes up there that were big physical specimens. And heck, we're used to thinking of big physical specimens when we think about Georgetown and historically. And certainly, if you followed Syracuse, if you start naming Georgetown players, my guess is you're going to start at centers and rip a few of them off. Well, what is Thomas Sorber? He's the leading scorer, leading rebounder. How good is this guy as a freshman right now?
The interesting thing to me about watching him was just the first time I saw him practice, I'm like, he moves really well for a freshman big. Like he sees the game really well. I think there are going to be times this year where he, against good teams, ends up leading them in assists, in addition to points and rebounds. He's really, really good. So I think that the other thing that we saw from the game up at West Virginia last Friday, they were really in it. And Sorber picks up his 4th foul with maybe 13 minutes to go, and West Virginia scores the next 10 points, and basically the game's over at that stage. He's the guy that needs to be on the floor for them to be able to really beat anybody of substance. It's probably not fair to put that sort of onus on a freshman, but it's the truth, especially with a backup center, Julius Halafanoa, who's out after suffering a fractured ankle over Thanksgiving.
Ooh, yeah. There's depth issues on both teams right now, for sure, with some injuries. What do you make of this game? Like, what do you think decides this game tomorrow, Patrick?
Oh, gosh. I think, first of all, one interesting thing I would point out is that, Syracuse, obviously kind of an average foul shooting team. Georgetown has allowed the best free throw shooting percentage in the country. Opponents are shooting 82% against them at the foul line this year. So that's sort of an interesting quirk. But I think ultimately it's going to be, can Syracuse kind of contain a guy like a Sorber and kind of match up there? I know, Georgetown saw Eddie Lampkin last year when he was playing for, he wasn't TCU, right? Or was he make a stop? He was at Colorado, wasn't he?
Yeah, he was Colorado last year, 3 years at TCU before that. He's been around the block, yep.
They did not see him last year. They saw him a few years back. They've actually played TCU a couple times. But anyway, I think that's going to be a really key matchup, how Sorber matches up on the inside there. And then also, I think you're kind of looking at a guy like a Micah Peavy, who's obviously established himself as an excellent defensive player. Who ultimately does he match up on in this game, especially, with J.J. Starling injured? He's going to draw a really good assignment, and whoever that is that number one assignment, can they get something going? So, how does Sorber do, and how does whoever ultimately Peavy is matched up on? I think those are going to be two really big factors in this game.
All right. And, in pre-JJ injury, it would be obvious who you'd toss your best perimeter defender on. Now it's like, okay, you've got some options here if you're Ed Cooley, to see how it goes. All right, Patrick, before I let you go, I do have to ask you one lacrosse. We can't, have you on and not talk like a little lax up here. Syracuse put out their home opponents today. Any early lax vibes? We're still way far out. Any early thoughts? We're trying to will Syracuse back to the Final Four for the first time in forever this year.
I've been saying this now probably since the end of last season. That you look at the way that things have gone under Gary Gate. They were obviously bad in year one. They made progress in year two to the point where they were an annoyance to some pretty good teams by the end of that season. And last year, they took the next logical step and made a quarterfinal, and really not that far away from being a Final Four team. I don't know if they're going to be good enough to win a championship, but you've got all these guys that have a ton of experience from over the last 2 years in that junior class. I got to tell you, I would expect there to be, after a 12-year hiatus, a big orange caravan making its way across I-90 to Foxborough this May. I don't know if that's going to be good enough to win a championship, but I do think that Syracuse is going to wind up one of the top 4 teams in the country this season. Man, 12-year hiatus, it is hard to wrap your brain around it, but yeah, it's going back to 2013 at this point, the last orange Final Four. 2009, the last title at this point, so we'll see what can happen this year. All right, Patrick, I'm sure we'll talk to you when we get closer to lax season, but thanks for some thoughts on the Hoyas, and great to chat with you today. Thanks a lot. Thanks so much for having me.
All right, there he is, Patrick Stevens. Covers lacrosse. That's, I think, when I first crossed paths with him. Bracketologist to the stars. He will get you with a basketball bracket and a lacrosse bracket. And, yeah, accuracy-wise, oh, yeah. So we'll probably have to have Patrick on come bracketology time as well. So great stuff there with Patrick Stevens, Washington Post for Georgetown and college hoops in the general DMV DC area, and much, much more. With that, we will take a break. Well, when we come back, we'll get Mike in here. A little Friday 411. What does that mean? It means NFL Films music. And I suppose we'll talk about the football games coming up. Are the Giants playing this? Oh, God, they are. The Ravens? Oh, no. Oh, dear. That next. Q Sports Talk, ESPN Radio.
The Sports